that's our friend Langdell and his ilk help us out with that.
I mean, you did have situations around the turn of the century where you had things that were called company towns, and usually associated with mining companies, for example. There wasn't a town where the mine was, and so...
Or timber companies.
Yeah, and so there would be a town that would be basically built by the company. And in fact, I was having fun with my kids the other day. The old Tennessee Ernie Ford song, 16 tons. It was about that situation.
Yeah.
And, just that there is an issue where, sin intrudes into everything. And so the issue is how do we deal with that?
Yeah.
And I think another good example of this was Roosevelt's, the first one, Teddy, and his view that in order to offset kind of the power of big business, you needed big government. In so many respects, even though we like to blame FDR, a lot of the problems with big government began with Teddy.
Yeah.
And his desire to provide some sort of balance to what he perceived were the injustices of the very large conglomerates, trust busting and all of that.
Right. Jeff?
Yeah. Well, the reason I was asking too is, the kinds of things that I hear about today being discussed as quote-unquote rights are things like a right to a living wage, or a right to housing, or a right to, a minimum amount of food, and just about anything else that you can think of. And so, the left is coming up with these ideas and then claiming that it's government's jurisdiction to provide all of that. And I can't imagine the founders thinking along those lines.
Well, and I think one of the discussions is always about the issue of what you might call passive versus active rights. And so the view of the right to life, for example, was considered to be basically a passive right. In other words, it's something where another person does not have the right to deprive you of your life, as opposed to that other person has an obligation to make sure that you live. Okay? So, and so you end up with these two sides of this. One is, the fact that you got to leave me alone, and the other side that you see today in all of these rights is that these rights make a demand on other people. Okay, so a right to a living wage is not a right that you have passively. It's a right that is incumbent, that you can then go to your employer and claim that he must pay you more. And that's one of the things that's changed in our understanding of what rights are.
I wanted to pursue what Doug just said about the competition of big government and big corporation, and just ask a question: is what should be the proper, Goliath versus Goliath, struggle? What the mechanism? Should it be just capitalism, or is it forming a union? Should the states take it over? What should be the proper mechanism that we as Republican, Federalists, etc., should kind of advocate for to counter the problem of excessive power possibly aggregating for whatever reason to the corporate or other entity?
Good question.
Go ahead.
On corporations, men are created by God, okay? Who creates a corporation?
Man.
Maybe that's the fundamental flaw in the starting point, thinking about corporations. They can get bigger than a man, in a way. And, maybe we have a Frankenstein here, created a monster.
Well, I don't know. I mean, there's always been the problem throughout history of wealth that gets accumulated by individuals, right? And you can either end up with Naboths, or you can end up with Jobs. And so I think that at the end of the day, what we have lost ultimately is the understanding and the belief that God is ultimately in control. And we want man to right every wrong, when some of those things actually have to be left to God, whether we like it or not.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I was thinking about too in response to that is if you think about Walmart, you know, they're kind of the 800-pound gorilla in the retail world, right? Yet they encounter significant opposition in a lot of places they go, right? Now, without getting into conspiracy theory and who's behind a lot of it and so on like that, who's really rebelling against Walmart? It tends to be a bunch of people who say, we don't want your stinking store in our town. Unless you're in Portland, in which case it's Mayor Adams. But my point is that there may be some organized opposition there, but generally speaking, it tends to be. I mean, when they were talking about putting a Walmart in close to where my house was, there was a neighborhood group that formed, and people got together, and they yelled and screamed and carried on in front of Washington County and the city of Beaverton until the cows came home. And that's still an open field.
Aren't they putting one in the old Hagen?
Yeah.
Thought so.
They put it
Well,
out in Cornelius
they said
instead.
they'd like to.
Thanks a lot.
But I mean, I cite that to say this. If enough people say, we don't want Walmart,
Ask the question.
it's probably not going to happen. There was a situation, and I think it was a Thriftway store out in Gresham. They bought some land, and they were going to put a big store in there. There was a lot of neighborhood opposition, so the people who were putting the store in promised that they were not going to cut down a bunch of old trees. And so the neighborhood opposition said, okay, as long as you leave the trees and do a few other things, we're good with that. So construction starts, down go the trees. Built the store, opened the store. After a period of a matter of months, store closed. Guess why? Nobody would shop there because they were mad. So, anyway.
I think the point being that if the government makes sure that there really is a free and open market, I mean, people get so mad at places like Walmart or Bill Gates with Microsoft, but quite frankly, those guys got big and they got wealthy because they actually did provide what people wanted.
Right.
And we may not like it, and I think it's more the politics of envy than anything that goes on here. But it's, you know, if you go back to Israel, Israel had a couple of things in its constitution that did tend to limit this. The first is that there was inheritance in the land. And so the land was permanently assigned to families, and they could not alienate themselves from their land. All right? So it was always theirs. But the other interesting thing is what would happen, let's suppose you had a freedom of contract in Israel, and you agreed to work for somebody, but in the end, in agreeing to work for that person at a wage that would not sustain you and your family, what would happen to you? You'd become a slave, right?
Indentured servant.
And what I've said many times is, I can afford employees. I cannot afford a slave. And if you understand what I'm saying?
You're saying that you pay your people a lot of money.
I'm saying I can pay my people not a lot of money, but a slave I have to feed. He's my property. I better take care of him because I want him to continue to provide for me. I need to pay for his health care, right? And so I can't afford a slave. I can afford employees.
Your own company town.
Got it.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing, I wanted to kind of wrap up here, but the other thing is, remember where the discussion started? Talking about public virtue? I mean, there was really a sense that whatever we do, the choices we make, ultimately should be good for our society, not just what's good for me. And that people would make that choice without being coerced or provided incentives or whatever. In other words, it started with the individual heart.
Right. And that's why Adam says that this Constitution's wholly inadequate for people that aren't basically of a Christian background, because it goes back to, if you want to make it so basic, if you don't love your neighbor as yourself, then if your goal is to take advantage of your neighbor, then where we end up is tyranny.